All right, folks, let's get started because here we are. It is time. It's quarter after 4 Pacific time where I am, and this is when we promised to get going. So here we go. Uh, Here to talk about a common leader or manager's pitfall. And I'm in my work, I'm talking with managers and CEOs and all kinds of folks up and down the company ladder. And I think that managing people is a hard job. And one of the most common pitfalls that I see people falling into is what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to call it the fantasy job requirements. And so your mind may now be going to, well, what job requirements are people imagining exist? And that's not quite exactly what I'm driving at when I talk about fantasy job requirements. More, here's basically what happens in so many businesses. I've got X, Y, and Z that I need to either do or accomplish in my role, right? So, it might even start with showing up on time, right? Showing up on time is something that I need to do in my job role. And so uh, I show up 5 minutes late and maybe nobody says anything. Maybe nobody says anything at all, right? It's been one time my manager doesn't say anything to me about it. They figure, okay, this is the freebie, right? Maybe I show up late again on another day. Maybe they don't say anything again. Okay, two freebies. I show up again on the third day. They say, hey, we really need you to be on time. Then I continue to show up late. Maybe it's not every time. Maybe it's even relatively rare, but it's still frequent enough to be a problem. And my manager mentions this to me time and time again, keeps telling me that this doesn't work. And if late to the office or late to work is not something that resonates with you, it might look like not raising your voice, right? That's a job requirement. It might look like making 30 calls in a given day as a salesperson. That might be a job requirement. It might be to smile at the customer. There are any number of things that you are looking for the people who report to you to do, and you've communicated this is your obligation. That's a job requirement until and unless there are no consequences for repeatedly failing to meet the standard. And what I see happen so often is that managers will beat their head against the walls. CEOs and other executives will beat their head against the walls, waiting and hoping and cajoling and exhorting their employee to start to meet the standard. And because there are no consequences, I'm going to call this job obligation, this job responsibility or job requirement, like showing up on time, or I was talking to some clients in the insurance industry last week, wearing clothing that's appropriate to the job. If there are not consequences, then what we're talking about is not actually a job requirement. It's a fantasy that you hold that it's a job requirement unless you as a leader allow there to be consequences. And notice that I say allow, because I just remember thinking that that it's rather than a job requirement right now, it's on your wish list. You wish this person would do it. And if there aren't consequences, then it's going to remain on your wish list and never be an actual and true job requirement. So I talked about allowing there to be consequences rather than bringing, or rather than visiting the consequences upon people. Very often what I find managers do is they kind of insulate people from the reality, insulate people from the natural consequences of their actions. So for example, If I am showing up continually showing up late to a meeting, and the meeting either waits for me, or if somebody says, if they interrupt the flow of the meeting to say, all right, Aaron, let's catch you up, then I'm being insulated from the consequences of being late. The natural consequences of being late to a meeting is that I miss out on the information. I miss out on the opportunity to contribute. I miss out on the opportunity to take part in the decisions that are made in the earlier part of the meeting. That's what happens naturally if I'm late to a meeting that began on time. But if the meeting doesn't begin on time, or if they catch me up, then I've been insulated from the reality of that, right? I think about somebody that I've worked with whose chief operations officer isn't delivering what is needed from somebody in that role. And that's been true for some years. And the consequences aren't permitted to reach his shore because he does good work. He works hard. And so the CEO hasn't said, okay, well, let me spell out discreetly, specifically, concretely what the expectations are, and let me help you see what the distinction is between what you're doing and what I'm expecting. And here's what's going to happen if you continue not to meet the standard, not to meet the expectation, right? Very often, I think one of the important ways to address when somebody isn't meeting the standard is to say, here's the standard, right? This is what we require from this position. If it's a non-negotiable deliverable, right? Like sales is one of the easiest places to look for this, right? A salesperson has got to be making sales. They've got to be bringing in revenue. If they're not bringing in revenue, if they're not bringing in sufficient revenue even to cover their salary, for example, then that's a non-negotiable. That's the company throwing away money. So to say what we need out of this role is this result. And if you are not able or willing to deliver this result, then we're going to have to find somebody else to fill that role because that role requires this accomplishment. Or if somebody's exhibiting what you think of as unacceptable behavior, to say, here's the standard of behavior. You're doing X, which falls outside the standard. We can't have X in this role, or maybe we can't have X in this company. So you're either going to give up X because we can't have X, or we're going to have to give up you because you're showing us that you and X are a package deal. And when you don't do that, when you don't immediately, swiftly, kindly, and I believe in servant leadership very much. It is your job as a leader to serve the people who work for you, to support them in succeeding. That doesn't mean that you do the job for them. It doesn't mean that you insulate them from the reality of their performance and the consequences, the natural consequences of their lack of performance. It also doesn't mean that you're punishing people. It's not in order to make up for your anger or for your disappointment. It's simply about doing the math and helping acquaint people with the reality. That's the other, I would say, the second piece of the job of a manager is to serve people who report to you, to ensure that they're meeting the standards of accomplishment and of behavior and so forth, right? And then the other piece of it is to help acquaint them with the reality. Because in so many of our jobs, especially these kind of knowledge jobs that so many of us have, the reality of the consequences of our actions may be a little more distant, maybe a little bit harder to see. So I'll say again, if you're not allowing the waves of consequence that naturally emerge from somebody's behavior, from their lack of accomplishment, from the way that they are accomplishing, if you don't allow those waves to splash up onto their shore, then what you're calling a job requirement is not, in fact, a job requirement at all. It's a fantasy job requirement. It's something that's on your list. It's something that on your wish list. And uh, if you're telling somebody on your team that they have a job requirement and you're permitting it to go on, and by permitting it to go on, I mean you're not permitting consequences, not just telling them, hey, this can't continue, but really providing consequences for it, then I love you and you're a liar. There's a place, there's a gap in your integrity right now because you're telling them that this is a job requirement and then you're not actually requiring it of them. So to come back into integrity is actually to be kind. I think it's Brene Brown who said clear is kind, and clear requires a consistent message. If you tell somebody that they've got to be on time, for instance, but then don't actually make it important that they be on time, then you're sending them mixed messages, and those mixed messages create tension in their own minds, and they aren't actually sure what's true, and so they're left uneasy with you. The relationship will always be uneasy because clear is kind, and insulating people from reality, as much as it may make them feel comfortable at a certain level, as much as it may be more comfortable for you than as a way of avoiding conflict on a certain level, it also creates an internal, very stressful tension for both of you. So clear is kind. So one of the things that happens, one of the ways that this is unkind, is that very often what will happen is that the stress of them not meeting the obligations, the job requirements, builds up in you as a manager, or builds up in the minds of executives above you in the organization. And then you either find that you can't bear it any longer and fire them, or you're actually required from above to fire them. And then that firing seems to come out of nowhere, and it is incredibly difficult for that person to stomach and withstand. And so I encourage you all, think of these consequences as what happens naturally. And consequences is actually a neutral term, So consequence means the result, essentially. The result of your performing beyond our expectations is that we look to give you a raise, we look to promote you, we look to give you more and more interesting responsibilities. That's a consequence of performing well. The consequences of not performing well is that this company suffers. The consequence of the company suffering is that the company then needs to make changes, including potentially removing some of your responsibilities, removing some of your privileges, removing perhaps your job. These are the natural consequences of performance. And and if you'll pardon my repeating myself, one of your responsibilities as a manager is to ensure that that people are well acquainted, better acquainted with reality instead of insulated from reality. So my work for you, my suggestion for you, get specific about what the job requirements are. Think through what the natural consequences of meeting those obligations or of falling short of those obligations. What are the natural consequences of that reality? And then help acquaint the people who report to you with those natural consequences, whether those are consequences for better or consequences for worse. And those are my thoughts for you today. I hope that they have been valuable to you. I've enjoyed sharing them with you. Bye-bye.